Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for coming on a warm late summer evening. But the reason is obviously a very, very valid one. Please welcome with me Martin Wolf. Martin, please take the stage.
So it's a great pleasure to be here again and to talk about my new book. It's quite a large book. I promise you I'm not going to cover it all, but I am going to give a relatively formal lecture about it, and then we're going to have a nice discussion. Before I start, I just want to say that the pretty obvious point that I started to write this particular book, frightening, or the idea of writing this book came to me in 2016. I think you can probably imagine why. There were two rather large developments in my life in 2016, political developments. And it took me a long time to write because it was first very difficult intellectually for me. And then, of course, things kept happening, like COVID, which at one stage I thought changed everything. And then I decided it hadn't. And now I think, well, maybe it has, but I wouldn't know how to deal with it. So I wrote whole chapters which then disappeared. So the result is the book took a very long time, and a lot that I was concerned about happened, and a lot that I was concerned about didn't, and I'm quite happy about the latter. So let me start then about the theme of this book. When I started to think about the crisis of democratic capitalism, which is of our political economic system. And I will start with a quotation, which I found in the course of writing this book. And it was a real astonishment to me when I came across it. And I will read the quotation, and then I will tell you where it comes from. Those of you who have looked at my book will know, but I can't help that. So it is clear then that the best partnership in a state is the one that operates through the middle people or the middle classes. And also that those states in which the middle element is large and stronger in possible than the other two together, by which the author meant the very wealthy and the poor, or at any rate stronger than either of them alone, have every chance of having a well-run democratic constitution. And this quote comes from Aristotle's Politics. So I thought, though Aristotle was wrong on so much, still he was one of the two founders of Western thought, I think, and I felt very happy with this quotation. To explain why I wrote this book, I should start with my own personal history. In 1937, my father left this city for England. His immediate family managed by a miracle to escape to Palestine in 1939, but their wider family was all stuck in Poland, and apart from one young woman, whom I got to know after the war, all perished. In May 1940, my mother's father, a self-made fish merchant, managed to hijack a trawler in order to take his family to England. He was one of 9. He asked his brothers and sisters to join him with their families. Nobody came. Their families also all perished. I'm not certain of the numbers, but something like 40 or 50 of my parents' aunts, uncles, and cousins were slaughtered. And this was, of course, the result of the collapse of civilization in Europe. There were, in my view, many reasons for this collapse, but important among them, I have always felt, was a profound economic failure. Above all, the Great Depression. That brought Hitler to power, of course, and we know that from the votes that the National Socialists won in Germany between 1930 and 1933. And I conclude from that, if people cannot gain a decent standard of living, a stable place in their society, a peaceful and stable order becomes almost impossible to sustain. And that is why the theme of this book, which I began as Donald Trump became president of the US and Brexit transformed my country, was so important to me. I am not, let me repeat, not saying that what happened then will happen again. I'm just saying that we cannot assume the stability of a civilized democracy, not even the most powerful, not even the United States. So let me start by talking about the democratic recession, a term which was invented by Larry Diamond of Stanford University, who I've got to know very well, who is among the world's leading scholars of democracy. In a liberal democracy, a democracy characterized by individual civil rights, the rule of law, and respect for the rights of the losers and the legitimacy of the winners, fair elections must determine who holds power. Attempts by a head of government and state to subvert the election or overturn the vote are evidently treason. Yet that is precisely what Donald Trump attempted to do both before and after the last presidential elections. He failed. Decent and brave people ensured that he would fail. But to this day, despite what happened in the midterms, Trump continues to hold the loyalty of his party's base, and whether forced or not, frightened or not, he also holds the express loyalty of nearly all its presidential candidates. And meanwhile, truly conservative stalwarts such as Liz Cheney, the daughter of Dick Cheney, of all people, were defenestrated, and her crime was stating that Trump's big lie, that the outcome of the election was a lie, is a big lie. So the Republican Party, one of the two main parties in the world's foremost democracy, the bulwark of democracy in the 20th and 21st centuries, is no longer committed to the most fundamental of all democratic norms, respect for fair and free elections. Yet how can a democracy survive if people think, as they do, that the only thing that matters is winning? Democracy must be founded on moral values, a belief that we are all citizens in a joint enterprise. We govern through debate. We argue honestly. With these values gone, what can be left in a society but violence? And Trump is, alas, far from alone, though he's clearly the most important figure, by far. Freedom in the World 2022, from the independent US watchdog Freedom House, published every February, has reported a 17th consecutive year of decline in the global health of liberal democracy. The democratic recession noted by Larry Diamond more than 1.5 decades ago looks a bit like a democratic depression, at least if you look at the global picture. The decline has occurred in all regions of the world, notably in the fragile democracies that emerged after the Cold War. But it's also observable, to some degree or less, in core Western democracies. So with that introduction, let me now turn to how democratic capitalism was born, the mixture of some form of market economy with democracy. A very interesting database constructed, as so many of these databases are, by American academics, Polity4 database, shows that 2 centuries ago, there were no states in the world that could possibly be described as democratic, in that they had really wide franchises and elections determined who held most power. Even where Republican institutions did exist, the franchise was highly restricted on the grounds of sex, race, and wealth. In the US, for example, I discovered that in 1800, approximately 6% of the population had the vote. Then in the 19th century, in the old world and the new, franchises began to be widened and universal suffrage democracy emerged and spread in fits and starts to cover some half of the world's countries, and there were many more countries because of the collapse of the empires after 1990. But since then, they have declined once again. It did not happen everywhere, but it happened in quite a number of important countries. So why did this happen? First of all, why were democratic principles accepted by so many countries? It's worth remembering that historically, the normal way to structure economies and politics of complex society has been for power to marry wealth and wealth to marry power. The most powerful people in society were the richest. Absolute monarchs, of course, owned everything. Why then did this revolutionary change towards democracy occur at all? The answer, I suggest in my book, lies with the emergence of a marriage, a very complicated and tense one, between two very different partners, the liberal economy and a democratic polity. Market capitalism and democracy are, I argue, complementary opposites. They have some very important ideas in common. The most important that they have in common is they reject ascribed hereditary status. They embrace the idea that social hierarchies of rank are to be rejected. People are entitled to decide things for themselves and achieve for themselves. Market capitalism rests on ideals of the right to work, individual effort, reward for merit, and of course, the rule of law. Democracy rests on ideals of free discussion and debate among citizens when making those laws. Historically, of course, the market economy as it began to emerge also brought with it profound changes in our economic and social lives. Urbanization, demand for a more educated workforce, the emergence of the newly organized working class, and as well as some opportunities for positive summed politics. Democracies rest on the existence of an economically independent citizenry. That was Aristotle's point. A fully socialist society, one in which the state owns everything, is inevitably a dictatorship, since the ownership of productive assets is then vested entirely in the politicians who control the state. Markets protect democratic politics from such an excessive concentration of power, but democratic politics, properly used and wielded, can also protect markets from excessive concentrations of economic power. And these are the respects in which the market economy and liberal democracy can be seen as complementary. But yet they are also profoundly opposed. Capitalism is inherently cosmopolitan. The democratic state is territorial. The market is the domain of exit. Democracy is the domain of voice. The market economy is naturally inegalitarian. $1, one vote. Democracy is egalitarian. One person, one vote. Tensions between capitalism and democracy are inevitable. Above all, if the economy fails to serve the interests of the majority, the sense of shared citizenship will fray, and populist demagogues are certain to emerge. Such populism is not, in my view, necessarily lethal for democracy. On the contrary, it's perfectly good so long as it takes the form of a justified hostility to predatory elites. But often it transforms into hostility to pluralism itself, and pluralism is an essential element in any democracy. In that case, democracy is transformed into a plebiscitary dictatorship, and ultimately a dictatorship tout court, in which the dictator insists, I am the people. Alternatively, at the opposite side, the concentration of wealth can lead to plutocracy, as wealth is once again transmuted into power. And the US of today is the most obvious example of the plutocratic turn worldwide. Indeed, it is quite likely to have predatory autocracy and corrupt plutocracy in uneasy tension. That was, after all, the governing system of the Roman Empire. In sum, democracy and the market are married to each other, but it is a difficult marriage, as so many are, and good politics consists of making the marriage work. Now let me discuss what's happened in the high-income democracies. Large rises in inequality over the last 3 or 4 decades and the deteriorating economic prospects of the old respectable, quote-unquote, working and middle classes in core democracies have eroded the foundations of democracy. And this has been particularly severe in the US. The fear of downward economic mobility has created status anxiety and profound political cynicism. These emotions, these angers, sources of anger, have then been diverted by clever right-wing propagandists into cultural and racial resentments, especially in ethnically diverse societies. This is, of course, not new. It has long been the foundation of the political culture of the American South. These resentments have, in my view, been greatly aggravated by the emergence of a large and discontented class of university-educated clerics dedicated to a cultural and racial transformation. This identity army of the left now clashes with and unfortunately motivates the majoritarian silent majority identity army of the right, creating a cultural clash in many of our societies. The emergence of the new media have facilitated all these trends, indeed worsened them greatly. A big question is what has happened to create what I call status anxiety. In the long run, I believe economic change has played a central role, particularly deindustrialization, rising inequality, falling productivity growth, and so forth, falling rates of growth of rates of improvement of our standard of living. It is an intriguing fact that the US and UK are the most unequal of the big high-income democracies, and they have also had some of the most potent populist politics. Now, the Chicago University economist Raghuram Rajan argued that many of these trends were papered over, it's a very good book he wrote about 15 years ago, by the huge credit expansions of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. But those credit expansions blew up in the financial crisis. The scale and visibility of that crisis and the subsequent rescue of the banks and bankers convinced many that the elites were both corrupt and incompetent. And after the financial crisis, and this is not widely known, there were dramatic shortfalls in growth rates of the standard of living across many high-income countries. To take the US, for example, because it's the most important, GDP per head in 2022 in the US was roughly 20% lower than it would have been if the pre-financial crisis GDP trends had continued. And I think it was because of the financial crisis that the Republican establishment became so ripe for Trump's populist takeover. But in truth, what happened discredited the establishment in both parties. People turned against those in power and authority. The shift towards skill-intensive sectors and technologies, deindustrialization of the labor force, globalization, and the rise of China were the product of and reflection of powerful underlying economic forces, very difficult to resist. But in my view, and this is explained at length in my book, there is also substantial evidence of the emergence of what I call rentier capitalism, with declining competition, growing monopoly, and unbridled self-seeking by corporate executives, particularly in the financial sector. Furthermore, the role of money in politics, especially in the US, has eroded the tax base and the effectiveness of regulation, as well as the extent to which democracy reflects the opinions and desires of the majority. No wonder people are so cynical. So where are we now with democratic capitalism? Branko Milanovic, a friend of mine and a former colleague, argues that today capitalism is alone. It has won. Nobody thinks there is really an alternative. Yet the crucial question for us is what sort of capitalism has won? Is it what he calls liberal capitalism and I call democratic capitalism? Or is it what he calls political capitalism and I would call authoritarian capitalism? I argue that there are two forms of authoritarian capitalism in the world today. By far the most common version derives from a hostile takeover of democracies from within. The would-be autocrat just eats it out. He starts as a populist demagogue, it's always been a he. Features of such regimes include a narrow circle of trusted servants, promotion of and reliance upon members of the leader's family, and officials running power ministries, the security services, the Defense Department, the Department of Justice, and so forth, who are personally loyal to the leader, not loyal to the state. Plutocrats find it necessary to support the gangster in charge. Ultimately, however, they find that they survive only as cronies. The other challenger is rather different, though it has some similarities. I call it bureaucratic authoritarian capitalism, namely the Chinese system. A communist bureaucracy operating a capitalist economy can, we have learned, be self-disciplined, long-sighted, and apparently rational. But I would argue that even bureaucratic capitalism of this kind also suffers from the well-known vices of authoritarianism, especially the tendency towards corruption and crony capitalism. These failings damage both the economy and the political legitimacy of the system, and that, I think, explains a lot of Xi Jinping's politics and policy. Bureaucratic authoritarian capitalism is nevertheless a significant challenger to the Western system. Yet we need to remember that autocracies remain, as they always have been, bad systems. They do not have a structure of accountability. They do not have open debate. They cannot ensure the peaceful transfer of power, and they tend towards unbridled cronyism and corruption. Moreover, we should also remember that despite all the strains of today, liberal democracy has come through many challenges over the past century. More fundamentally, it is the right system. It rests on the magnificent belief in the right of people to make up their own minds and lead lives they choose within societies whose joint decisions are taken with the active consent of the government. So if I may conclude, the renewal of democracy and capitalism, and I won't go into all the detailed suggestions in my book, which is very lengthy, the renewal of democracy and capitalism must be animated by a simple but powerful idea, indeed the core notion of democracy, and that is citizenship, shared citizenship. If democracy is to work in the long run, we cannot think only as consumers, workers, business owners, savers, or investors. We must think of ourselves as citizens. And citizenship has to have three aspects: loyalty to democratic, political, and legal institutions, and the values of open debate and mutual tolerance that underpin them, concern for the ability of fellow citizens to live a fulfilled life, and a desire to create an economy that allows all citizens hope of a better future. And that, I think, at least for me, is my manifesto for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for your inspiring lecture, and especially also for the inspiring book. You said it already, it is quite lengthy, so there are a lot of elements you couldn't talk about now and you couldn't touch now, and I try to touch some of them now in the question and answer and on the floor now, and then after half an hour, you also as the audience have the possibility to be involved, but most of you, you know it already. Let's start with two, let's say, silly questions, but I know it's silly, but I'm brave enough to put them forward, because sometimes one has to ask the silly questions to make the things more clear. If you're talking about the authoritarian danger, let's call it that way, of these right-wing populists, yeah, we know them all. We are here a model country. Then we also have to ask the question, why are they authoritarian? They don't call themselves authoritarian. They don't want an authoritarian system like the fascists did in the 20s or the 30s. On the other way, they are telling, oh, we are real Democrats. We are representing the will of the people. We are representing the will of the people against this allied system we are now living in. Can we really call them? What's authoritarian on them? And maybe are they right? Maybe they are right. Why are they authoritarian?
So I think my test of whether a system has moved to become authoritarian, which is, of course, as I stressed, for a whole host of reasons, nothing like the authoritarian regimes of the first half of the 20th century, including, of course, the communist regime, is whether there are any plausible assumptions under which they can lose an election. And that is to say, is there control over the institutions of the state, over the judiciary, over the business elite and therefore the flow of money in politics, over the media, namely who they put in charge of these things, such that in practice it is impossible or nearly impossible for an opposition to win. Mm-hmm. And I think we can think of a fair number of countries where we're pretty close to that. Mm-hmm. And there are some where it was very close, but actually it turned out, Brazil is an interesting example, mm-hmm. and America last time, that actually the institutions of democracy are sufficiently strong that genuine electoral competition is possible. But that's clearly one part of the program, as I've discussed it, of the modern authoritarian, or illiberal, if you like. The best books are on that topic, and they're very good, are co-authored by Daniel Ziblatt of Harvard, whose work, How Democracy Dies, mm-hmm. discusses this at great length. If you can't be defeated, then, because you basically control the instruments of state so effectively, then I would say this has become what I call a plebiscitary dictatorship. Dictatorship may be a bit harsh, but essentially you've switched over. The second point, which I think is not quite the same as democracy, but is very important to me, I am very clear from the beginning, and partly because I think it's a protection against this sort of thing, that I'm talking about liberal democracy. And as I explained, liberal democracy includes a range of individual rights. Now, I believe these individual rights, rights of assembly, rights of free expression, and so forth, protection against certain forms of discrimination, so forth, are good in themselves. Therefore, there are things we should cherish. But I also think, actually, if you don't have those rights, freedom of association, protest, and so forth, the democracy becomes very thin, to put it mildly, and is on borderline on the verge of death. So my answer to the people who tell me that they represent the will of the majority is they may have done so, if the people understood it, when they were elected, but 10 or 13 or 15 years later of rigged elections, is it really a democracy? I don't want to talk about any of your neighbors. So one of the best examples close to us in a very, very important country is Turkey. Mm-hmm. Is Turkey a democracy? Mr. Erdogan would insist exactly what you say. And it may be even true. I'll add one final thing. Of course, if it is the case that you are a state which is formally democratic, and the majority consistently wants an authoritarian and oppressive system of rule, then I would say that they can achieve democracy, democratically the end of democracy. Mm-hmm. But that's where they're going to go.
Mm-hmm. We can also talk about neighbors, because the point is Hungary is very close to that, what you talked now about. Maybe Italy not yet, but these are two.
I think Italy is not yet. Yeah. But the most people who know more about Hungary than I do, probably everybody in this room, would suggest that it is, and I've talked to a lot of people in the opposition, really hard to organize opposition in this country, and in that case, it's not a democracy.
Second silly question. Then afterwards,
it wasn't a silly question. It was
afterwards the smarter question. But this is you are talking. Your book is about the crisis of democratic capitalism, and you make a strong argument for the marriage of democracy and capitalism. That, to put it simply, the one thing couldn't be without the other, and vice versa. So we are now here in the living house of a former socialist party leader who has a long history, who was Socialist Party activist for a long time, and at least at some parts of the time, the person who lived here would have asked, why shouldn't be socialism be married with democracy?
Well, I thought about it. I could have written a completely different book, but it would have not been a book that would have been expressed any of my comparative advantage. So I try to write mostly about things I feel I know something about. But I think it's a logical conclusion from reading my book that social democracy, which is essentially the synthesis around which post-war Europe built itself, is a very satisfactory way of combining the two. Mm-hmm. And I tend to think of the founder of social democracy, well, we can obviously go back to the revisionists in the German Socialist Party in the late 19th century and all the squabbles about that, and I don't want to go into that because obviously they're incredibly important, but I think of it sort of this tradition starting with Tage Erlander in Sweden, and it was immensely productive. And I think the distinction between social democracy and pure socialism, pure example, is absolute. And the existence of private property is part of that. And so in response to what you say, I'm not saying that I gave an a priori set of arguments in my lecture. There's much more in the book about the difficulty of making genuinely competitive politics in a society in which all wealth is controlled by the state. Because it means the political leaders control all wealth. And that has two consequences. One, they control everybody's lives. And two, if they lose everything. And that's really important. If you're in a society in which if you lose power, you lose everything you have, that becomes really pretty scary, and people like that don't allow it to happen. And that then leads to my crude empiricism, which is, well, it's just never happened. There are many different kinds of democratic societies with very different legal arrangements, substantially different legal arrangements, different structures of property, different sorts of welfare states, and all the rest of it. But a society without a market system coordinating a sizable part of the economy that is also a vigorous and competitive and stable democracy does not exist and has never existed. So I would suggest that quite apart from my a priori arguments, evidence is telling us that this doesn't work. Now you could argue, I'll make this the final point, of course that's just because the people who wanted to create a fully socialist country were fanatics who wanted to establish complete control over everything. So in some sense, it attracted the people who behaved that way. You know, that's Lenin. But that, of course, is just another way of saying the same thing.
Now to the more difficult questions. In your book, you make clear that the crisis and the crisis of legitimacy of liberal capitalism is very strong connected to more and more insecurity in the lives of the people. And also in their expectations about this future, if they have still some kind of security but feel it's not stable in the future. If the expectation of the future became darker and darker, then we have also an emotional arrangement, which is which makes the dangers for democracy stronger. So you told us already you started with writing with your book with 2016, and as everybody knows who read the book, you finished it sometimes in 2022. Something happened since the war, the inflation crisis. There's much stronger feeling of insecurity. In Austria, in Germany, real wage losses of 4%. These are huge elements. What do you think? How can you comment on that? Because they changed something very strongly since you finished your book, and not for the better.
Yes, I thought when I was writing this book that, which shows that I was too optimistic in this respect, is that it was pretty clear, if you looked at the data, that you had a big problem in the US and UK. Yeah. You had a pretty big problem in France, which is long-standing, and a pretty big problem in the UK, in Italy. But I would have regarded, to take the two examples, Germany and Austria, as highly successful societies with fully functioning economies and a stable consensus, partly rooted in historical experience around the idea of preserving democratic norms, because after all, they'd had some experience, if in the fading past, of the opposite. But your point, and I can read polls too, is that that isn't true. And it underlies, it's not in my book because, as I pointed out in subsequent writing, obviously the last few years have seen a series of shocks which were not enormous in scale, but in the short time period into which they were compressed. Three major crises in 3 years is very rare. Unrelated crises, that's what's so interesting, and has destabilized things further. But it comes against a background of profound economic changes, which are also triggering very profound social changes, which are bigger and longer standing, and a lot of them I do talk about. So, but I would say it's worse. Now, so let me give you one example of this. When I'm thinking, I wrote about tech and all this. So, we are in the verge now. I won't talk about AI or those three. We are on the verge of the complete transformation of the motor vehicle industry. It's completely obvious. It's been obvious to everybody who thinks about it for years, but people in a very important country next to you really didn't want to think about it, or not very much. And at the end of this revolution, the motor vehicle industry invented by Mr. Benz in the late 19th century will have disappeared in large measure. And that is going to create for Germany, a stupendously large, a very large adjustment shock, which will hit precisely the sort of middle class that is the bulwark of a stable democracy. And I have no idea how this will play out, but it worries me. And that's just one example of a shock that is just starting. So we're going to have a fourth shock, by the way, which is a series of industrial revolutions driven by the electrification of the world and AI, such that 10, 15 years from now, I expect our economies to look quite different from what they do now. And the winners will not be the people I care about here. And that is very, very concerning.
So the problems these people we are talking now, the problems they have is first economic problems. The problem, deindustrialization, unemployment maybe, or losing job security.
Certainly
or,
losing job security.
Losing
the emergence
wage,
of insecure employment is an important theme.
yeah, and losing the wage level. There might be a lot of different problems. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that many people in the last decades already had the impression that that not only their lives is become more difficult, that they are also they are losing respect. So we are touching now already these cultural questions, because it's an economic question, but it's also connected with the cultural questions. If you feel disrespected, if the people have the impression they are others, they are in a higher status, they are looking back down on me. So how should this change?
In the course of writing this book, I came to think more and more about this, and if I had thought about it more when I started, I might have structured it a little bit differently. But I make what I think is a very important point. Perhaps it is what you might call the Faustian bargain of the dynamic economy. The dynamic economy has generated, if you compare our lives with 200 years ago, obviously extraordinary rises in living standards. But it doesn't stop. And in the process of changing the economy, it changes society unbelievably powerfully and very, very quickly. So it's now obvious to me, it should have been obvious before, that in the last 40 years, there has been a profound transformation of what I suppose one might call the class structure of our society, in favor of what people sometimes call knowledge workers, and people who are mostly go to university, who get increasing their suffering for the same problem. I won't go into that. But they have benefited very much from the development of the economy. And one of the consequences of this, and I got this in the book, but not enough, is we have a new class which is immeasurably, when it comes to bigger and more influential, though it's not a majority, than their forebears were. And the way I capture this is very simple. So, when I went to university, 5% of British young people went to university. 5 years before I went to university, it was 2%. It is a long time ago, but in my lifetime. Now it's close to 50. Mm-hmm. And so we have created a huge class with very powerful expectations, very modern attitudes and values, which is moving towards not a majority, but a hugely powerful minority, predominantly under 50, well, overwhelmingly under 50, under 40, who will be the future, right? And they are really different from the people you talk about, because the experience they've gone through, the sort of work they do and capable of, and the way they think about it is really different. And at the same time, I've got data on that, the decline of the working class in their core functions, above all working in industry, well-paid job, has been rapid. I mean, really, really rapid. And it was one of the great surprises I discovered that Germany's labour force, though from a higher level, has deindustrialized more rapidly than ours in the last 20 years. That's a tremendous shift in power and influence in our society from one group of people who were the core of our society, the dominant factor in the social democratic parties and so forth. The trades unions were immensely powerful. They still are in some countries, but they're still in decline. To another. That's one change. Now, I'll mention another one, which is, I think, the greatest single change in our societies in my lifetime, which is the transformed role of women, which I think is absolutely wonderful. But of course, it's a function of profound economic change. And the traditional male advantage in the economy was simple muscle power. A lot of the work men did in the 19th and early 20th just demanded a lot of effort before they died. That's completely and utterly irrelevant now. The economic change has facilitated a profound social change, and in most of our societies now, the future implications of this are fatty. The great majority, I mean really significant majority of people who are graduating from university are women. Mm. This is another colossal transformation. Reactionary politics against these things, which is a large part of what we're seeing, is I now feel was probably inevitable. And we just didn't think enough about it. But if the economies had worked well, if society had seemed well run, if the people in charge had seemed competent and decent, we might have managed this better. But they weren't, and we didn't. And now we are where we are, surrounded by a very, very large number of people, really large number of people, who are angrier than I ever imagined. And once you get that, they will vote for anybody.
But the social change you described now, to put this argument further, would mean that the share of the population of people whose economic outlooks are positive is greater and greater, and the share of the population where the economic outlooks and prospects are worse, they're becoming a minority. So then we don't have a democratic problem.
I think there are two problems with that. One, we're at a crossover. Mm-hmm. So I think all the old people in Britain who voted for Brexit are dying. Mm-hmm. So 30 years from now, I suspect it's actually true, just numerically, by the way, since it's now 7 years since the vote, that if you held the same vote and the same groups voted in the same way, the outcome would be the opposite. Because the younger then, who are now older, and they haven't changed their minds, interestingly, which is as far as we know. So that's optimistic. Mm-hmm. However, there is a downside to this, which is that we have created in a lot of our societies a very large fringe group. I don't know whether this is true in Austria, but it's certainly true in Britain and America, of people who've gone to university and who didn't go to the right universities. And they have these attitudes, which is generally, I think, positive. But they're not getting the jobs they hoped for, because the things they were being trained for have not grown to the degree they hoped. And I'm afraid the AI revolution is likely to make that much worse. Mm-hmm. So we could easily find, I hate being so depressive, that the deindustrialization process continues for all the automation of everything, but it is not clear to me that the new class in its scale is going to be a very happy one. And certainly in our society, I don't know how this works, and in America, the young, educated feel, for a result of a whole slew of economic and social change, also very disadvantaged and very angry. It's just their anger comes out in a different way. What that will look like 10, 20 years from now, I don't know, but I don't think, it doesn't feel to me when I look at these groups that anyone except the top 1% or 5%, whatever it is, are going to be really happy.
I just want to ask two more questions, and then the audience has the possibility. You are bringing forward in the second part, or in the last parts of your book, some proposals what has to be done. The analysis, we have this crisis of democratic capitalism because we created a broken system with much more inequality, predator system, financialization, all of that. And you describe very convincingly that the political elites, but also the functional elites and also the economic elites were responsible for that. And then you have proposals how to fix it. Maybe you can touch some of these proposals and also answer the questions, how should this work with the same elites who broke it already?
Well, that I think is the much more interesting question than the former, and it's the question I ducked, because the reason I ducked is I don't know the answer. The social. So I'll give you first, but I didn't have the nerve to go into this because I don't regard myself as a sufficient expert. So how does political change happen? Well, first there have to be motivated large groups who will support relevant changes and demand relevant changes. I think that a necessary condition for that, and I think it's what Joe Biden thought, is to renew the alliance between very broadly defined the intelligentsia and the working people. And when I think back on social democracy, and certainly in most of the countries I know, that was the alliance. Of course, the relative weight of the different groups has changed, but if you add the young people I talked about and the working class, they're a majority. Of course, to do that, to bring them together, you have to have a program that works and gets round the problem of identity politics. Because if you're on that, you're split and you've had it. And I discussed that, and I think it's clearly what Mr. Starmer is trying to do in Britain, and it's what Biden is trying to do, and it's not hopeless. But it turns out to be very, very difficult because
Scholz also did this with his Respect election campaign.
Sure.
Olaf Scholz.
Yes, exactly. That is the attempt, and it is, I think, to me, in terms of class structures and politics today, since there isn't a natural minority, there has to be that, and it has to downplay identity politics and pay more attention to providing people with better lives, which brings you back to the in a different sense, mid-20th century politics. I think once you've decided that's what you can do, you've got enough support for that, there are quite a lot of things you can do, but how they will work depends very much on your starting point. So in the British and American case, we clearly need a more effective welfare state than we have. I have become more sympathetic to industrial policy. I think we need quite a lot of intervention in the labour markets to improve the way they work and to give greater security to workers. It's not a position I would have held in the past. For instance, the precariat problem that we have has to be dealt with. I'm not in favour, but I'm open to persuasion of universal basic income, but there are circumstances in which we would have to go there. I also, this is perhaps the most radical set of proposals, I could go into those further, but that's sort of the outline. What you do in Austria, I have no idea. So I'm not going to even mention that. So
we don't even.
So, but I mean, I don't know how these things work. I also hope, if we sustain democracy, if we sustain it, that the emptiness of the radical right's promises will emerge, as has happened in Britain with Brexit. We've actually, I think, sort of regretted. All the evidence is that we've regretted it. I mean,
the only point in Austria, we are regretting it already the third time.
Oh, well,
so
I can't.
People forget.
I can't do anything about if people don't learn. That is, of course, a risk. But I think that Meloni will turn out to fail. I think Marine Le Pen, if she's president of France, will turn out to fail. And if there are successful elections, that might be helpful. And certainly Brexit has been helpful for the stability of Britain. There's no doubt about it. And that's why we've got Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, who are boring, dull people, just the sort of people I want to be in charge. So the experience might help. But the other thing I suggested, which is probably the wildest idea here, but then this has become increasingly fun, is the idea of using citizens' assemblies as ways of trying to get ordinary people engaged with the political process to lower the temperature on deeply divisive issues. And one of the best examples I gave in the book comes from Ireland, which was famously Catholic and reactionary, and was the Citizens' Assembly they established on abortion, which reached a consensus and randomly selected people over a year, and that consensus, when put in their report, became the basis of the referendum, which ended the abortion issue in Ireland. That's a fantastic achievement. I think we could have done similar things with Brexit. Now, there are lots of issues you can't do about that, but I think the idea of bringing ordinary people into the political process in this way is probably part of what we need to both essentially to reduce this sense of the yawning gap between the elites who run everything and ordinary people who are the victims. We have to change that if people are to sense that democracy belongs to them.
That's the last question. Is that what you meant with citizenship at the end of your book?
That's part of it.
Because usually people would think, or I would think, citizenship, yeah, for sure, we should be that way, but we also see from experience that civil society alone cannot fix it. You need parties that are working. You need parties where it makes sense to engage. You need political leaders also where you think, okay, they will fix it. Civil society cannot fix it for them.
Of course. I mean, I think it's a mutual contract between the state must care for citizens, all citizens. All citizens are really crucial. But of course, citizens need to be more engaged. Now, this then gets to the question of the future of political parties, the funding of political parties. I think, at least in the Anglo-American setup, their funds either come from very rich people, or they are grossly inadequate, therefore they can't. So I do believe in state funding of political parties, particularly think tanks that are associated with them. There has to be an active effort to increase the capacity of political parties to engage both with the people and with the responsibilities of policy. And in our societies, Britain and America, the political parties are almost completely hollowed out. They're shells. And of course, they can't be expected to produce first-rate governments if they're shells.
Thank you, Martin Wolf, for the lecture and also the dialogue we could have here on the floor. And now I give the first thing I have to do, my glasses. The first person I saw is the gentleman in the third row.